Hello, this is the Pandemic Baseball Book Club, in which authors of baseball books talk to one another. My name is Don Zminda, and today I'm going to be talking to Jim Leeke, the author of a fine new book about Grover Cleveland Alexander that I forgot the title of. I'm going to start over again. God, I was going to bring your book down, but I didn't. It's
the best game over there.
The best game over there. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay, starting again. Hello, this is the Baseball Pandemic Book Club, in which authors of baseball books talk to one another and explore each other's work. My name is Don Zminda, and today we're going to be talking to Jim Leeke, the author of The Best Team Over There. It's a book about Grover Cleveland Alexander's experiences during World War I and afterward. A wonderful book. I just finished reading it, and great work, Jim. You had previously written a book about baseball during World War I. Tell us a little bit about that book and about how that interacted and led you to writing about Grover Cleveland Alexander.
Sure. The earlier book, From the Dugout to the Trenches, I wrote because I couldn't find a book like it anywhere. I got interested in World War I baseball, and as I started to dig into it, I was amazed to find that no one had done a book about it. So I did it myself, and it was a really interesting project. It actually came out of the old Army newspaper, Stars and Stripes, which was in Paris during World War I. 10 or 12 years ago, I happened to see a bound compilation of the Stars and Stripes editions, all of them, in an antique store in West Virginia. And that copy was falling apart, but my wife got me a complete copy for my birthday, or for Christmas that year. And I got fascinated by the newspaper and by their sports page. So that was my introduction to World War I baseball.
Okay. And how did you get interested in Alexander specifically after writing the first book?
Well, it was interesting. I did quite a lot of interviews and signings and so forth for that book. And at every one, literally at every one, somebody asked me about Grover Cleveland Alexander. And I put a little about him in the book, but I thought, well, if everyone is asking me about him, it's time to dig in a little more.
How did you go about doing the research for the book?
It's mostly from newspapers. The baseball side, I should say, is mostly from newspapers, and a few memoirs and that type of thing. But this is an odd hybrid sort of book. It's as much or more a military book, World War I book, as it is a baseball book. So that led me to dig into regimental and division histories and that type of thing. And again, you can find an awful lot of information and material through the newspapers. Many of the small town newspapers of that era printed letters from soldiers in their daily or weekly editions. So I found an awful lot of information that way as well.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the most interesting parts of the book. I mean, it really made the whole experience come alive because you see it not only from the point of view of Alexander, but also other people who were sharing similar experiences. I really found that quite compelling. How did you get access to these like military archives, like historical documents, like regimental histories and things like that?
Well, you know, many of them are online nowadays. I couldn't probably have written this book 20 years ago, or it would have taken me a great deal more work. But the internet is just amazing in that regard. You can find so much more material from your desk. Regimental histories, divisional histories, personal histories. It's astonishing. It really is.
Did you have to do microfilm research as well?
I did a little, not a lot, with the various online newspaper archives. you can cover a pretty good stretch of the material.
Yeah, and there's more of it all the time too.
I know, it's amazing.
Yeah, it's great. It really, I've written a book just recently about a similar period, baseball in 1920.
Right.
And, it's astonishing what you can find online.
I was listening to your interview with Steve Steinberg just this morning. It was fascinating.
Yeah, it was an interesting subject as well. But about your particular book, it contains one story that I was unfamiliar with, and that is how Alexander's injury when he was in the minor leagues, he got hit in the head by a thrown ball. I had not been familiar with that injury story, and also how it related to the epilepsy that he developed probably as a result of that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. When Alexander was still in the minor leagues in 1909, he was playing in a game and he was running to first base on an infield hit, and I think it was the shortstop throwing to first base and went wide and hit him in the head, hit him in the temple, and he was unconscious for quite a while. Today, we would probably call that a traumatic brain injury or a TBI. And it's interesting, at some point later, it's unclear exactly when Alexander developed epilepsy. And there is some correlation between a TBI and epilepsy. Not necessarily going to cause it, but it can. And I actually spoke with a neurologist about it, and he was very helpful. And he said, well, there's no way to know conclusively now. It's entirely possible that the brain injury led eventually to the epilepsy. And it's more likely than not that Alexander developed the epilepsy before the war rather than later.
Did he frequently suffer seizures when he was a ball player?
He did, and his teammates would cover for him. It wasn't really well known at the time. As I say, it's unclear whether he developed it before, during, or after the war. There are some accounts of him having seizures beforehand. Those are somewhat disputed, so it's unclear. But at some point, he definitely had seizures while a ball player, and his teammates routinely covered for him, and you just wouldn't find accounts of it in the sports press of the day. And it's interesting. When he was in the Army, or when he was getting his draft physical, he just didn't mention any of these problems. And if he had, it's possible, not certainly, but it's possible that he wouldn't have been accepted into the Army. But if he was suffering from epilepsy at that time, and he mentioned it, and that was the reason he wasn't accepted, then he would have had to explain it to the baseball world. And 100 years ago, epilepsy was not well understood, and players who had it usually didn't speak of it and tried to hide it. So it's possible that Alexander simply didn't mention it because he feared the consequences.
Were there other players who had epilepsy?
Interestingly enough, Tony Lazzeri did.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah. And I'm sure there must have been others. I don't have their names just off the top of my head.
Now, Alexander got married shortly before he was shipped overseas. Was his wife familiar with this condition?
She said later, that she wasn't until he came back from the war. They were having dinner with some of his old artillery buddies. And one of them said, Pete, what was that spell you had in France? And she said that was the first she had heard of it.
Really? Now, he possibly could have been exempt from military service as a result of the epilepsy, but for understandable reasons, he didn't talk about that. He also likely could have avoided military service by working on a farm. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. He came from a farming family. If he had returned to the farm, to work it, he possibly could have received an exemption. Other men in his county did, not just in his county, but nationwide. Agriculture was one of the exceptions. And there were some snide remarks here and there in the press about Grover, growing corn rather than going to France. He never sought that farming exemption. He did ask for deferment on the grounds that he supported his mother, but he came from a very large family, and apparently the board didn't accept that argument. So when he got his draft notice, he didn't argue. He reported as ordered.
Yeah, one of the things that I found in doing my own book about the 1920 season was I did allude to the wartime period before that. And it always seemed to me that the individual draft boards, there was a lot of variance in how they went about, filling their recruitment levels and their attitude toward different people, often with the same circumstances, being treated in completely different ways. So, and with the question of somebody who worked on a farm, there were also a number of players who worked in shipyards during World War I. And for the most part, from what I could see, it was pretty legitimate and important work. Now, they were hired by the shipyards who liked their ball playing ability. There's no question about that. But they did do actual work. They did support the war effort. And it was perfectly legal for them to do it. But nonetheless, these players got an enormous amount of vilification for doing that. They used to call them shipyard slackers. And the kind of vile press that they received, it almost made it seem like it wasn't worth it for them to be trying to do that. I mean, Jackson, the Chicago Tribune wrote an editorial ridiculing him for taking that job. So they were really, it seemed like they were really under a lot of pressure to serve in the military.
That's right. The shipyard teams and the steelyard teams, they're really interesting. There was a lot of hypocrisy in the sporting press and in the country as a whole about the ball players. Pretty much you were either a slacker and a bum because you weren't in service and in France, or you were a hero because you were in service and in France. There was no shading, or very little shading. Hero or bum, that was it. And it was completely unfair to both sides, in my view. The shipyards, those were exempted jobs. We needed the shipyards, we needed the steel, we needed the ships, we needed the weapons. Somebody had to build them. Those were exempted jobs, and they needed to be. And the ball players who played shipyard ball, for the most part, were married men, often with families. Completely legitimate to take those exemptions and do that work, which for the most part they did. But in the press, as you say, they got a very bad rap. And in the games, they'd often hear it from the stands as well. Joe Jackson was the first big name to jump. And he was the lightning rod. Boy, he just took all the grief. But he was married, he had the job, he did the work.
Well, he had a very legitimate reason for not even going into the military in the first place, because he was supporting his wife and his family as well. But that was never given any kind of consideration at all. Even Charles Comiskey turned against him, which I think was one of the reasons why Jackson ended up in the conspiracy in the 1919 World Series.
Right, Jackson really heard about it, and so did the others, but especially Jackson. And there was some lessening of that feeling after the armistice, when the ball players started to come home. And the sporting news, which was right out there leading the charge.
Yes.
Even the sporting news backed off a little bit. There was a really interesting editorial in the sporting news saying, well, some of us have been in service now too, because we were called And we understand this decision a little better now. So it's time to stop vilifying the shipyard and steelyard players and welcome them back along with the troops. So it did slacken a little bit, but for a while there, it was just brutal.
Absolutely. So getting back to Alexander, in the midst of all this, before he went overseas, he was traded by the Philadelphia Phillies to the Chicago Cubs. Can you talk about that trade? Because that was really one of the bigger trades in baseball history. And there must have been a lot of controversy about it because he was such a big star.
There was a lot of controversy about it, and the Philadelphia fans were not happy, as you can imagine. Our Sabre friend Jan Finkel calls it one of the most controversial and cynical trades in the history of baseball, because the bet was by the Phillies that Alexander was going to get drafted and they were going to lose him anyway. The bet by the Cub was, well, he may get drafted, but we might get most or all of the season out of him. The Cubs lost that bet. Alexander played only 3 games before he ended up in khaki.
Yeah, but they did seem to have the hope that he would be playing for them during that, much more during that season.
They hoped he would be playing into the season, well into the season anyway, but it just didn't work out.
And he ended up going to the World Series without him.
The local draft boards had a lot of leeway, and it was the local draft boards who decided when you went and in what order. And the local board called him, and they called him because of agriculture. A lot of people in the list before him were farmers, and they got the exemption, and Pete Alexander didn't. So his number came up and he went.
Early in this experience after the war started, he had the opportunity to join the Navy, but ended up not doing that. Why was that the case?
He waited too long. Once you were called and you had a date, you couldn't then enlist in another service. Other players had done it earlier because they acted sooner. And Pete Alexander just frankly dithered about the decision. And it's interesting, it's speculation, but a TBI, one of the things that can interfere with is what's called executive function, decision making. So it's possible that he simply wasn't very good or very capable of making that type of decision. And he just sort of went along with things. Mm-hmm. He didn't pursue the deferment. He didn't pursue the Navy who really wanted him. He just sort of stood there until they took him.
I see. So he does get drafted. He gets his training in Kansas, is that correct? And can you talk a little bit about the kind of training that he and the other soldiers went through?
Well, he reported to Camp Funston, and the division there, the 89th Division, and specifically the 342nd Field Artillery Regiment, they had good ball clubs, and they had several major leaguers. And as soon as Pete reported, they said, okay, we want him. So he went into the 342nd, but he had his initial training. Then when you first got to camp, you were segregated. You were put into what was called a detention camp. That sounds terrible. Basically, it put you in isolation because of all the illnesses at the time. And by the time you spent 2 or 3 weeks there, and you got really very little training, it was basically a holding area. And you got your inoculations and you got some, very basic military instructions. But then you reported to your regiment, which is where you really learned what you were doing. But practically as soon as Pete got to his regiment, they headed east and eventually, took transports to Europe. So he knew very little militarily when he got to his regiment. He didn't really get much training about being an artilleryman until they got to France.
Yeah, that was one of the things that really struck me. It seemed like they didn't have the right equipment to train on. And
Yeah.
these guys were basically farm boys who pretty much had never been away from home to any great degree, kind of thrown into this military situation, and then not to even have the right equipment to train on to learn what they needed to do when they got to Europe. That seemed
That's right. The United States Army wasn't remotely prepared to fight World War I. Not at all. They didn't even have places to train that many doughboys. They, initially they called up the National Guard. They had camps where they could train them. But for the National Army, the drafted men, they simply didn't have any place to put them. So they had to build the camps, the training centers. And that went on until fall of 1917, which is why the 1917 baseball season was so little affected on the major league level. Even if they drafted them, they didn't have anything to do with them and to put them. So the first major leaguers weren't really drafted until the end of the 1917 season. So Alexander wasn't drafted and put into the Army until late April of 1918, and initial training in May. In June, they head to France. So even if they had been prepared and had the equipment and everything ready to train him, he didn't have time to get trained anyway. So when the regiment got to France, his regiment as a whole at Camp Funston didn't have the equipment, didn't have the training, didn't have the mechanized vehicles they expected. They were a mechanized field artillery outfit that never got their vehicles and tractors until after the war was over. So they were using horses like the Civil War, as was much of the American artillery. So they couldn't put them at the front as soon as they got to France. They went into another training camp in France, and that's where they really learned how to be artillerymen. Yeah, it's kind of shocking when you think about it.
Yeah, it seemed like there were a lot of bad experience with the horses. They weren't reliable. A lot of them died. It was very difficult to move from place to place. And it appeared that the weather was miserable as well. I mean, they really had a lot of difficulties to put up with.
They really did. All the armies went through the animals at an incredible pace. There were millions of army horses and mules used in Europe during the war. A huge percentage of them died either in combat or disease. By the time Alexander's regiment got there, there weren't that many animals left. Our army, the American army, was always short of animals. The training was brutal. The animal rights people today, they would just go ballistic at the conditions that the animals found themselves in. So, a lot of Alexander's regiment were from the Ozarks. They were farm boys. They pretty much knew how to handle animals, but a lot of them, like the ball players, a couple of them were from the Dodgers. They didn't know anything about animals. One of them was a stable sergeant, and he didn't know anything about animals until he got into the service. So there were so many learning curves that it was ridiculous.
Some of the people in Alexander's unit were either former or current major league players. Can you talk about a few of those people?
Sure. I've got a list right here. There was Alexander, of course. There was Otis Lambeth, who was a pitcher for the Indians. There was Clarence Mitchell, pitcher for the Dodgers. I'm sorry, an infielder for the Dodgers. There was Win Noyes of the Athletics, Chuck Ward of the Dodgers, and there was Frank Wetzel, who later played for the Browns. So there were half a dozen ball players in that regiment on purpose. The regiment went and got them, all of them, because they had a tremendous ball team. But once they got to France, that they didn't play much ball. When they were in training, they played on Sundays. They had a few games in training camp, but of course, once they moved up to the front, nobody was playing baseball.
Yeah, that's really kind of different from what happened in World War II, where there were a number of players who served in World War II who did a lot of ball playing, and in fact were kind of deliberately kept from combat situations because it was felt that their ball playing and their experience was helpful to the war effort, that it improved morale among the other soldiers. People like to watch these guys play. So they were kind of shielded from combat, but it appeared that there was very little, if any, of that during World War I.
Well, there was some of that in World War I, both in the Army and the Navy. There were fine service teams. And as you say, they served completely legitimate service, legitimate duty as recruiting tools, really. They were used that way. But there were a number of teams from combat units, like Alexander's, who, and those ball players did get into action. So there was a dichotomy. There was, but Alexander's unit, one of the show teams of the Army, great baseball team. They were a combat unit, and when they got there, they weren't ball players anymore. They were artillerymen, and of course they had to be. You go to the front, nobody's going to treat you like a ball player. Mm-hmm. You're a soldier, and you either know what you're doing or you don't, and your buddies can trust you or they can't. So once you get up there, when you get out that far, ball playing doesn't enter into it.
Well, once they got into combat, there were some pretty intense situations. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. They got into the front just after the San Miel, and forgive my French, French. Most of the Army moved in, then pivoted and moved towards the Argonne for the next great offensive. Alexander's regiment stayed put. They didn't make that pivot. They held the line where they were because you've got to. You can't abandon one section of the front to launch an offensive in the other. They were fairly near Metz, which was German held city. So they were holding the line, but that doesn't mean it was quiet. There was still shelling back and forth every day. The regiment was in the line 7 weeks and fairly constant shelling both ways most of that time. And Alexander was under shell fire quite a number of times, as well as sending it in the other direction. And he told later of one German shell that came and didn't detonate, but came bouncing past him. And if it had gone off, he and most of his battery, I suppose, would have died, but it went on past and buried itself in the mud. So it was fairly hairy situation.
And given the head trauma that he had experienced, that had to be extremely difficult for him. I mean, just the sound of all those guns must have been.
The noise was unbelievable. Everybody in the regiment, in the artillery regiments, talks about the constant noise. I mean, it's bad enough in the trenches when the stuff's going over your head, but when you're firing it, the noise was tremendous. And Alexander suffered some hearing loss as a result.
Yes. By the time they got into action, the war was close to being finished. Of course, they had no way of knowing that at the start of it, but it seemed to be extremely intense right up to the hour of the armistice on November 11th. Wasn't one of the heads of his unit criticized for continuing the fight right up until the last minute?
That was his division, the 89th Division. And the commander of that division did intentionally push his men forward until the last minute. He had some number of dozens of doughboys killed on the last day, and he got a lot of criticism for it. The 342nd at that point was separated from the 89th Division now. They were supporting other divisions at that point because the 89th pivoted to the Argonne. The 342nd stayed where they were and supported the 37th and 28th Divisions. But yeah, there were commanders who pushed as hard as they could until the very last minute. And then there were others who didn't.
Yes.
And you get strong reactions on both sides on that issue.
Oh, I can imagine. Now, after the war ended, he ended up having to stay in Europe for several months. Is that correct?
He did. The 89th Division and Alexander's regiment literally marched into Germany as part of the Army of Occupation. So they were there into the spring. Alexander came back before most of his regiment, as did a number of other ball players who were in the Army of Occupation. The Major League ball clubs pulled some strings to get some of the players back. With the help of the Army, it has to be said. But yeah, it was. Alexander still didn't get back as quickly as some of the other ball players in Europe.
And once he got back, he played for about another decade after he returned from Europe. Certainly one of the things that he is known most for were his difficulties with alcohol. When did those problems start and how serious were they?
They started in a serious way in France. He drank before the war, but he said mostly beer. And in fact, Billy Sunday, the ball-playing evangelist, held Alexander up as an example of a player who didn't drink to excess before the war. Alexander said he didn't really begin to drink hard liquor, serious alcohol, until he got to France. And there are some stories about him not in action, but afterwards being drunk. And it's steamrollered on him afterwards. It got progressively worse. You can tie that back to his very complicated medical history. He had the TBI before the war. He had the epilepsy before or during the war. He developed shell shock, or what we now call PTSD, during the war. You combine that with, alcoholism, which isn't unusual in someone with shell shock. Self-medication, essentially. And going along with the poor decision-making, all of it combined, it's a very, very serious and bad combination. And he pitched until 1930. To me, the story isn't that he was an alcoholic. It's not that surprising, given his medical history and his experiences. The amazing thing to me is that he pitched until 1930. He performed as well as he did, another 11 years. That's fairly astonishing, I think.
But he was never really the same ball player after he came back. But that was unusual.
The 3 seasons before he went away, he won 30 or more games each season. Only Christy Mathewson had done that. But when he came back, he was a good pitcher. And he was a clutch pitcher sometimes. But he wasn't Alexander the Great anymore. I don't know how he could have been.
But he did have that great moment in the 1926 World Series.
He had that great moment seventh game, and bases loaded, he's called in from the bullpen having pitched the day before. You hear stories both ways. He was drunk when he came in. He wasn't drunk when he came in. Alexander and his wife always swore that he was sober, but he was exhausted. He was napping in the bullpen.
Sure.
And he came in, the bases loaded, no place to put Lazari, and he struck him out. And then he pitched the final 2 innings as well for the World Series victory. That's clutch, and one of the great moments of baseball history. And even the sports writers of the era couldn't quite believe what they had seen.
For sure. He pitched, he actually made it back to the World Series in 1928, but did not do well during that year. But that was so, you could say that the 26th World Series was really his last big hurrah.
Yes, it probably was. He went on in his last victory. He thought he had surpassed Christy Mathewson. And it turned out there was an error in the records. And in the 40s, Mathewson got one more victory accredited to him, so that they were tied. They're still tied 3rd place for the most victories behind.
Not a bad guy to be tied.
And Walter Johnson, but. Yeah, the Lazari thing was probably his last truly great moment on the field.
But after his major league career ended, he continued pitching for a number of years. Can you talk about that a little bit?
He did. He went to the minors for a while and just sort of bounced around. And then he played for a number of years for the House of David barnstorming team, which is a fascinating club I wish I knew more about. He traveled with them, and for a while he actually cleaned up. For a while, his wife was with him and kept him sober, but he couldn't maintain it. And after he finally stopped pitching, he just bounced through a series of jobs for years. He was never very well after that. He was never gainfully employed for very long after that. The last years of his life were just this long, terribly sad decline.
Yeah, it always seemed to me that baseball did not treat him very well. That, the Phillies or the Cubs, could have found some use for him. He was certainly a smart ball player. He could have been useful as a coach. Just to have him around would have been of some help to the team, but they kind of turned their back on him. Well,
yes and no. I mean, he wanted to be involved. I don't know that he was capable of it. Some of the baseball figures tried to help him. They tried to help him get sober. They paid for him to live with a farmer back home in Nebraska to keep him out of trouble. He got what he thought was a small pittance from baseball, a small pension. It didn't actually come from baseball. It came from one of his old pals, who was paying it. People tried to give him jobs outside of baseball. He would take them and not be able to hold them. Maybe baseball could have done more with the systems in place today. I think baseball would do more for Alexander and people like him. Back then, there wasn't much in place, really. But on the other hand, Pete Alexander late in life was a hard man to help. He wasn't a mean man. He wasn't a bad, physically violent drunk, or not by any means, but he couldn't stay sober. He couldn't hold a job. He couldn't steady himself as much as people tried to help him, and his wife tried to help him. They were married and divorced twice. Even when they weren't married, she still stood by him, but he was a very hard man to help late in his life.
Did his hometown turn on him as well?
that's what he felt. He went home to St. Paul, Nebraska. It's a small town, many times. He never stayed. He died in St. Paul in November of 1950, getting ready to leave. He didn't usually pity his circumstance. That was one of the rare times when he felt that St. Paul wasn't treating him right, that the bartenders wouldn't serve him anymore. He was getting ready to leave when he died suddenly. And his wife, his ex-wife, Amy, gave the Sporting News some letters he had written about his unhappiness with St. Paul, which I think is unfortunate all the way around. He had sometimes disappointed St. Paul, like after the Lazzari strikeout, there was a celebration and something went wrong. It's never exactly clear, but people were put off. He disappointed them somehow, not more than once over the span of years. So it's understandable hard feelings in St. Paul. It's understandable that he was sorry that he went and he was getting ready to leave. But over the decades, that feeling has passed, and those people have passed. Everybody has passed. And now St. Paul, Nebraska, every summer has a Grover Cleveland Alexander Days, and they've had it for quite a while now. You know, it's a big deal out there. I hope to get out there myself one of these days, and I'm glad for that. And I think Pete Alexander, if he could look down and see that, would be glad for that. And maybe even the people who had turned against him in St. Paul would be glad for that. It's a sad story all the way around, and it takes some distance to see things clearly and understand them a little better, I think.
Sure. He did have what seemed to be one nice moment when he was invited to the 1950 World Series, in which the Phillies were in the World Series for the first time since Alexander's playing career. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. This was in October 1950. The Whiz Kids got into the series. They lost it, but they got into it. And somebody paid, I think it was a radio station, paid for Alexander and a young companion from St. Paul to go to New York to see the series. And they were in the park, standing room only tickets. That's what they had. And somebody recognized old Pete and took him up to the press box. And the writers all clustered around him. There's Grover Cleveland Alexander still. And he talked to the sports writers who all wrote about him. After the series, he was invited to the celebrations and he spoke a time or two. And he felt appreciated again. And that was a nice moment. And he got good press across the country. And then he went back to St. Paul, and the following month, he died suddenly. Some people said that trip had taken it out of him. I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think he was near the end anyway. But I think it's really great that he had that one final moment. And with the Phillies, imagine, with the Phillies. So he died at least knowing that people still remembered him and still thought well of him in baseball fandom and among the writers.
Well, your book helps keep the memory of him alive, and it's, to me, it's an incredible story. He went through so much. He had a difficult life, but he had a lot of triumphs as well as a lot of sad moments.
He really did. And I think that him going on as long as he did, as well as he did, I take that as a kind of triumph. And I think it was a triumph that even on his low points, people thought of him kindly. He appears to have been a kind, gentle man. Everybody said so. Even when they wouldn't serve him anymore, they didn't think he was mean or disreputable. He was just flowing through life as best he could at that point. And I think holding on to his gentleness was kind of a triumph in itself, especially given where he'd been and what he had seen and experienced.
Absolutely. Do you have a copy of your book you can hold up?
I do right here.
And
There.
who was your publisher?
University of Nebraska Press. They do a lot of great baseball books.
They really do. Are you working on anything else right now?
Lately, I've been doing a lot of short form things. I've been doing some pieces for the Sabre Bio project. Those are fun. I have an idea for another World War I baseball book, but I also have an idea for a 1930s aviation book. So I haven't quite decided in my mind yet what's next. So I'll keep doing the bio project things for a while.
Well, that's great. Jim, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and it's a wonderful book. And I encourage anybody who's watching or listening to this cast to read your book, because it's terrific.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. And thanks for the good chat today. I appreciate that as well.